So this Wednesday afternoon, Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, is giving evidence in front of the Privileges Committee in the House of Commons as part of its inquiry into whether he may have misled Parliament in statements he made in the Commons about Partygate back when he was Prime Minister. So perhaps it's worth us sort of talking a bit about how we actually got to this point in the first place. So back in late 2021, we started hearing all of these allegations about what might have been happening in Downing Street during the pandemic. We had the Sue Gray inquiry by a senior civil servant into what was happening. The Metropolitan Police conducted an inquiry. And of course, throughout all of this, Boris Johnson, while Prime Minister, was being asked in the House of Commons about what was going on and what he knew and when he knew it and all of these things. And from that, there sort of was a sense that perhaps Johnson at some points might have misled the House of Commons in terms of what he was telling them. And so back last summer, the Commons as a whole voted to refer this matter for investigation by something called the Privileges Committee, so a cross-party select committee of MPs. They started their inquiry late last summer, and now here we are, it's March 2023, and we will now actually be hearing from the man himself, from Boris Johnson, on Wednesday afternoon, talking about what he knew, when he knew it, and answering the committee's questions.
It's important to say, isn't it, this isn't the first kind of piece of evidence that the committee's got. So they've done a lot of research already. They've done interviews, they've taken in written evidence, they've seen photos from people who worked in Downing Street, trying to understand, kind of build a bigger picture, I guess, of sort of what happened and how that related to what Johnson was telling the Commons throughout all of those questions that were being asked as these news reports were coming out. And the committee published its own sort of initial set of findings a couple of weeks back, didn't they? Sort of saying these are the things that we've understood, and presumably that's going to kind of form the basis of their questioning of the former PM.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, starting kind of late last summer, the committee approached the government to ask for it to turn over any sort of relevant evidence. So a lot of that will have been things that Sue Gray would have looked at in doing her report. But they've also been able to take additional evidence. They also have asked Boris Johnson for any written evidence that he might have. Worth saying that all of that evidence will be disclosed to Johnson himself, so he will have the chance to review it. And as you say, a lot of that evidence takes the form of kind of WhatsApp messages, internal communications, photos, that sort of thing. Some of that we have seen publicly, some of it I don't think we yet have. But of course, they are also inviting Johnson to give evidence publicly in his own defence. It's understood that Johnson will be submitting written evidence as well to the committee at some point before Wednesday, this dossier that we keep hearing about in the news that will be coming out. And then, as you say, a few weeks ago, the committee published this sort of interim report where they said, here's some of the evidence we've got so far, and here are what we think are the kind of principal issues that we want to talk to Johnson about. And so, as you say, we expect that is what will form the basis of the questioning on Wednesday.
I think it's worth saying, isn't it, like this goes beyond just a kind of what happened at the parties and who knew what when. It's kind of becoming a question of the relationship between the executive and the legislature, and how Parliament can really hold ministers, or in this case a former minister, to account, what standards are expected of members of the government when they are appearing in the House of Commons. And also, it's understandable, it's got very political. There's been lots of pressure from certain groups of Conservatives on the committee saying this is a Labour-led committee because it's being chaired by Harriet Harman, and the fact that Sue Gray is reportedly going to be Chief of Staff to the leader of the Labour Party has kind of muddied the waters around her report as well that she did in her former capacity as a senior civil servant. And so there's been a lot of criticism as to, okay, is this committee inquiry legitimate? Is it just a kind of witch hunt by opponents of the PM? And I think how the committee kind of handles that will almost be more interesting and more important than what they actually find about what happened.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And as you say, this is really about fundamental principles of how our Parliament works, which is, as you say, that the principle is that ministers are accountable to Parliament. everybody inside Parliament needs to be accurate and honest in what information they're giving to Parliament. That's how we know that the scrutiny that is happening, the debate that is happening in Parliament is of a high quality and that it's founded on accurate information. That's particularly important for ministers, as you say. And of course, at the time that Johnson was making these statements, he was in fact Prime Minister. So that's absolutely crucial. And I think you're also right that this is then about the ability of the House of Commons and of the UK Parliament to enforce its own rules. This is not a legal process. This is nothing to do with the courts or judges. It's completely separate. This is about parliamentary rules, parliamentary customs and conventions. It was the whole House of Commons that opted to refer this matter to the Privileges Committee. And as you say, although the committee is chaired by Labour MP Harriet Harman, a kind of veteran Labour MP, the Conservatives still have a majority on that committee. Something that's quite interesting to note is that interim report the committee put out a few weeks ago. That was unanimously agreed, which indicates that the committee is kind of leaving its politics at the door. And actually, they are working as parliamentarians first and as party political MPs kind of second. So I think that's really crucial. And as you say, there have been these sort of grassroots efforts to try and put pressure on the Tory MPs, on the committee. Interestingly, last week we saw Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House of Commons, actually say in the Commons that what the Privileges Committee is doing is really important, and to make it very clear that she takes a pretty dim view, and the government takes a pretty dim view of these attempts to kind of pressure Conservative MPs. But as you say, this is as much a test of Parliament's ability to uphold its own rules and values as it is of anything else.
So the hearing is on Wednesday, potentially going on for 4 hours.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'll be watching all of it, but I'm sure some keynotes will be. But that's not the end, right? There will be. This is just one stage in the inquiry. It's already taken several months. It's going to go on for a good while longer.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's already been a lot of evidence that the committee has considered. It will be taking this evidence from Johnson. It will want to go away and consider that. It is possible that they might have further oral evidence sessions, perhaps including Johnson himself again, if they feel that that's necessary. But either way, the committee will then have to go away, think about all of this evidence, and ultimately make a decision on, do they think that Johnson misled Parliament? If so, do they think that constituted a contempt of Parliament? In other words, it interfered with Parliament's ability to actually do its job? And if so, what kind of sanction they might recommend? But it's really important to say that the committee alone cannot decide any sanction that Johnson faces. So any recommendation that the committee have about what sanction he should face, it will ultimately be up to the whole House of Commons to vote on that. So all of that is quite a long way down the road, and there's still quite a bit of this process left to go.
Absolutely. And just on that point, I think it's really important to say, isn't it, that this is a parliamentary process now. It is not about the ministerial code. It is not about Johnson. It's about while he was Prime Minister, but it's not because he is a former member of the government. It's about the relationship of one MP to the House of Commons and how the House of Commons enforces its rules rather than the government enforcing its rules on ministers.